A huge welcome to everyone who's joining us today for this Waldensian occasion. And we remember that it's been quite a time since we had a gathering, and we're looking forward very much to hearing a variety of talks and re-energizing our connections with the Waldensian story. Your committee is almost entirely here and are going to be interested in any comments you make about the format of the meeting and ways in which we can and speakers for future events that we might incorporate. So without more ado, I wish to invite our distinguished colleague, Leslie Griffiths, whose entry in Who's Who is very long, in recognition of his distinguished contribution to representing Methodism and the Christian faith throughout the United Kingdom and beyond. Now, I haven't got in front of me the details of the title of your talk, Leslie, but can I first of all welcome you and say how grateful we are to have you present in our midst on screen. And if you would do me the kindness of opening up with a prayer, that would be really very much appreciated, and then to move to your talk.
Okay. Are people hearing me? That's the first thing. Yeah, good. Well, what a pleasure to see you popping into my home one at a time with varying degrees of difficulty. It's been quite a soap opera just getting you all together this morning. So it's very nice to be with you and to see you in the way that technology now allows. So I will start with a prayer, and but let me, before I do that, indicate that I don't have a title because I wasn't asked for a title. I was asked just to pick on one or two things that are happening in my life at the moment that might have a significance you would be interested in. So it's guesswork on my part, and that means you can either resign yourselves to the next, say, 10 or 15 minutes where I'm regaling you with stuff you're just not interested in. But you can, of course, make yourself a cup of coffee on the sly whilst I'm talking. It's not problematical. Anyway, let's begin with a prayer. We thank you, dear Lord, that despite the fact that we're in such different places, technology now allows us to be all together. And we pray for the next step along that road, that being together visually might have added to it the sense that we are together spiritually. Hold us fast in your love, and may this time together be a time of real blessing and refreshment for us all. We ask this in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Right, well, it has been a very interesting time for me, and really or a significant part of what I want to share with you came to its conclusion just yesterday when I traveled back from Strasbourg, where I'd been in attendance of the Council of Europe meetings that I now am part of. 4 times a year, I go to Strasbourg for a week at a time, and I take part in the debates of the Council of Europe, which is focused on human rights, democracy and the rule of law. And if ever there were a time when those emphases needed special attention more than this, then I'd be very surprised. I also sit on the Council's Migration Committee, and I've been parked this last week at seat number 250 in the hemicycle, where we do our debating, very firmly between two Italians from Torino. So I felt imprisoned by Italy this particular week. The great thing about going to Strasbourg in this way is that you really do get to know people from across the continent. 46 different nations are members of the Council of Europe. Remember, it preceded the European Union. It came into being immediately after the Second World War, as we tried to deal with mass migration, with total chaos and political disorder. So the work that is done is very significant. At the moment, of course, there's an erosion of for example, the Convention on the Status of Refugees. The 1951 Convention is being eaten into by governments like our own, who are rewriting parts of it to suit their immigration policies. And we try to send out clear signals to the governments doing this, that they really are neglecting a fundamental part of the philosophical and political basis upon which modern Europe has been built. Well, the Migration Committee itself, well, there's another story. We rejoice that the British government has at last signed up to something called the Istanbul Convention, which safeguards women from violence, especially in times of mass migration and social disorder. And we have signed up to it after 12 years of waiting to, but we still haven't agreed to all the principles of the Istanbul Convention. And one of my tasks in Parliament, our Parliament, is to remind Her Majesty's government of their continuing obligations in this respect. So it's very interesting. Strasbourg, I spoke 5 times, 4 times in the plenary assembly and once in the Migration Committee. We had a Nobel Prize winner for peace, a Ukrainian woman, talking about her work in the field of human rights in Ukraine. She's a hardened professional, hardened, that is, because for years she's been dealing with difficult problems. But it didn't take long for that apparent hardness to be softened. She broke into tears more than once, telling us the story of the kind of suffering that people are undergoing in Ukraine at the moment. And curiously, it was the simplest tales that were most tear-jerking. I mean, there were tales of rape, rape in front of children and members of the family, the attempts by the Russian soldiers to make the point that there's no such thing as Ukrainian blood any longer. They're impregnating women with Russian futures, and it's just awful. Or gouging a woman's eye out with a teaspoon, for example. I mean, we had all of these things told us in graphic detail. But when a simple peasant woman who'd watched her husband killed in front of her spoke, she said to the soldiers who killed him, he was just a farmer. To me, he was our whole universe. It's been very touching to talk to the Ukrainians who've come out of Ukraine for the meetings this last week. We talked also about Lampedusa and the work of the Waldensians and other Italian Christians in dealing with the bits of the refugee movements that they're involved with. But waiting for us in the British Parliament are struggle after struggle after struggle, because our government is intent on they're fixated on the boats crossing the channel. And as I kept saying to a conservative member of our delegation, next to whom I had the displeasure of sitting at a meal, that his signing up to the business of turning people back is in direct contravention of the Geneva, of the United Nations Convention. The three principles are no discrimination. What does the British government do? It discriminates. No penalization. What does the British government do? It penalizes. And it's just a dreadful time for us. Anyway, there we are. That's the marvelous times in Strasbourg, meeting people from France and from Hungary and from the Czech Republic and all over. It's been a wonderful week for me. And of course, the connection I have with you seems to add to my credentials for being there, to be in Europe amongst Europeans, with me able to say, not only am I British, not only am I Welsh, but I'm also in a very close relationship with the Waldensian people from northern Italy and from across Italy. Indeed, I met two people from Sicily who were Waldensians whilst I was there. Well, that's one of the three things I wanted to say to you, and I shan't take quite as long with the others. We have a full morning, and certainly if anybody had any questions, I'd be very glad to have a go at them. But the second is I'm working across a number of groups of people to improve our attitudes towards race in general and anti-Semitism in particular. Just 10 days ago, I've been very fortunate, well, in unfortunate circumstances, to have as a kind of godson a boy from a Sierra Leonean background. His mother died of cancer 20 years ago, and her last words were to Margaret and me that her son, whom she'd struggled so hard to bring up, was now our son. And indeed, that's exactly what he is, and what a blessing to us he is. Anyway, after a series of jobs in community action and in community animation and social cohesion and all the buzzwords that have abounded in the last 10 years, he ended up in the Rugby Football Union. He's responsible for their diversity programs, but also to improve and to enlarge the field of action of women rugby players in North London. So we watched this with great pleasure, but he had the dream of holding an awards event for Black British rugby players. And so I hosted that, this lonely white face of mine, a supporter of Welsh rugby, opening the floodgates to English rugby players in the House of Lords. And we had 160 Black rugby players or officials or referees or whatever they were in the House of Lords. And it was a fantastic evening. They became aware of each other first time. And it was brilliant. And that lines up with other initiatives that I'm taking just at the moment. I've got a private members bill waiting to be debated that will improve access for Black people to our universities. Now, some progress has been made, and there's a higher tally of Black people now than there were 5 years ago. But we need to disaggregate the totals to see where those Black people are ending up. A, in terms of which universities they're going to, and B, what subjects they're doing. I mean, if you've got an extra, I don't know, 10,000 people in our universities, and they're all doing sewing and knitting, well, you get my point, don't you? Are all these new people sort of spread across the faculties, law and engineering and mathematics, and as well as business and education and so on. So the private members bill will come up shortly, and I will be leading from the front on that one. I'm going to Israel with a high-level parliamentary party in May. We should have gone in September, but the Queen decided to die. And the president of Israel was in Britain instead of being in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, where we were supposed to meet him. Now, I have hesitated such a long time before accepting the invitation to go. I don't know how to open my mouth and say the right thing when talking within issues that emanate from the state of Israel and from the plight of British and other Jews. It is so fraught with the possibility of saying the wrong thing. And then came the elections, which have put Benjamin Netanyahu back with an extraordinarily right-wing government. I'm even more afraid now, but I have signed up to go. And I shall need the prayers of everybody, because I'm not known for not saying what's on my mind. That's the trouble. Well, there we go. Sort of this across-the-board desire to see the good things of this wonderful society we live in spread properly across the board for all people to enjoy. Well, there you are. A bit. Those are two of the three things. The third is that I came back from Strasbourg and then popped straight into the Royal Festival Hall yesterday to get an honorary degree. And I got an honorary degree from Roehampton University, and I stood there in all my grandeur, the only recipient of such an award. And I just found that my heart and my mind were flooded a little with thoughts of my dear mother, who died nearly 50 years ago. She only ever knew a simple life in a small village. She'd only traveled a couple of times beyond Wales, once to help her older sister with the birth of a child, and the other, well, we better not talk about it, because it was to Paris to see us, and it was a miracle of all sorts that got her there. She traveled on her own and found her way to Gare du Nord, and I still can't work out how she did it. But that she might have seen what's happened to me. It's been an extraordinary life that I've lived. And of course, this last year, I have celebrated my 80th birthday. And I'm still jumping up and down on trains and running after buses. And I mean, how much longer can this go on? So I just thought I'd share that little rather more lighthearted sort of end of piece with you. There's a lot more on I've got a list here in front of me, and I will not bore you with them. And as soon as this little moment is over, our meeting together this morning, I shall go to my desk and prepare for tomorrow morning's service, which I will do bilingually in the Welsh chapel in the centre of London. So there we go, from the Waldensians to Wales, nonconformists, all of us, and great joy it gives me too. So thank you for your attention. You've been a very silent audience. Now that's the great thing about Zoom. It keeps you all in your place. And I look forward to sharing the rest of the meeting with you.
Thank you so much for those thoughts and the insight into your busy and productive life and the interesting challenges that you produce for other people and exciting occasions that you create. So can I ask if anyone would like to ask Lord Griffiths any questions?
If you have any questions, could you raise your hand using the reaction buttons, because it then brings you to the front of the speakers and we can see that you're asking to ask a question. Thank you.
Nobody wants to ask a question, but I just want.
No, you've got Lord Griffiths. You've got two questions. Yeah, two. First one from Simone.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask the impact of the Council of Europe in the perception that, for example, the British government or the Italian government might have of public opinion of what the debate on these immigration matters are. I mean, do governments take any actual account of the Council of Europe? It seems to me such an underreported piece of work in the media and so on, and to what extent it can actually influence decision process in individual countries. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you're quite right. It is underreported, and it does get mixed up, certainly in the British mind, with the European Union, with which it has very little to do. Its agendas, that is, are different. There are 20-something members of the European Union, 46. We have, you know, we have Moldova, and we have all the Baltic states, and all those neighboring Russia. I mean, Poland, poor Poland, flooded with refugees from Ukraine. Belarus, what on earth do we do with Belarus? All these things are very much, and Turkey and Greece, and we have shouting matches between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I mean, when you see them on the speakers list, you know you're in for fireworks. And we keep on saying to ourselves, well, we have heard it all before, but it's better to have them here with others, getting it off their chests, than, as they did, of course, 2 years ago, taking armies onto battlefields and dealing with all kinds of things there. So, but you're quite right. How does it get better reported? We, in our delegation, and we have a delegation from the British Parliament of 30 of us, we have resolved that one of the things we must do is ensure that in the chamber of our two houses, Commons and Lords, we keep raising questions that we have been engaged with in Strasbourg and making it clear to the House as a whole that these discussions are going on across Europe. We have a job to be ambassadors for the very experience that I'm reporting. But you're quite right. I mean, I was asked 2 years ago to write a report to remember the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Status of Refugees. And it took me to Geneva and, of course, Strasbourg and London and Rome and other places to discuss with the heads of Amnesty International, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and all the rest of it. And I had my report adopted unanimously, and I've been able, in the British Parliament, in debates, for example, on international borders, the Borders and Nationality Bill that we passed onto the statute book just recently, I was able to remind the House and to make an appeal to the judges and to the learned and noble lords, the barristers and the legal profession, to keep battering at the government that is undertaking illegal actions in the way it enacts its immigration policies. The government, of course, will not tell us what legal advice they're being given. They swear that what they're doing is legal. And I say to noble and learned lords, here am I, a poor ex-Methodist minister, the intricacies of the law are beyond me, but you, noble and learned lords, you know the truth. It will depend on you to ensure that this government is held to account in terms of its obedience to international law. So in those sorts of ways, we keep the presence of the Council of Europe alive and its voice heard in Parliament. But outside Parliament, well, I don't think that people are terribly aware of it. I just wish they were, because remember, rule of law, democracy, human rights. We spent half a day this time in the court, in the International Court for the European Court for Human Rights. And we heard, what did we hear? We heard that 260 cases from Britain have been referred to the European Court of Human Rights. And only 5 of them have been admitted, and only 2 of the 5 have led to judgments of the court. remember that our present government is highly critical of the European Court of Human Rights. They want to bring responsibility back to our courts, but 2 out of 260, and in neither case were the judgments contrary to British law. So these sorts of things I want to tell everybody, and I'm glad to tell you this morning, but it needs better reporting, no doubt at all.
Thank you, Lord Griffiths. Anne Hollows has got a hand up. Anne. Oh.
Where's Anne gone?
Hello,
Anne,
hello,
hello,
hello, Leslie. Thank you for all that you're doing. It is really hugely appreciated among all of us who work with refugees and asylum seekers, and much of what I wanted to know you just elaborated. I just wonder whether you feel there is more that the Methodist Church and the Waldensian Church could do together to support the work, particularly the work that's going on in the Mediterranean, and the amazing work that the Waldensians and other Christian groups do in Lampedusa in southern Italy, and whether we should be working jointly as our churches to bring these issues much more to the attention of people in our churches.
Well, there's only one answer to that, and it is yes, of course. Of course, but Anne, it's lovely to see you. I want to know if Ian Morris is the Ian Morris I once knew a long time ago. Oh, my dear boy, Dr. Ian Morris. Well, you're looking as young as you ever did, man. Sorry, it's just seeing people that I haven't seen for a very long time. Well, Anne, yes. I mean, there are flashpoints. There are the people coming up to Europe from the Horn of Africa. You know, there's not just people crossing the Mediterranean, but going up through the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and so on. Turkey and Greece. Greece has just abandoned an attempt to pursue people helping those who were drowning at sea. I mean, how on earth can you accuse somebody in a court of law of trying to save the life of somebody else? I mean, it's just rubbish. So yes is the answer. I have to say that I've had a good long lunch with Rachel Lampard recently to raise precisely the point that you raised, that we need to bring to people's attention in a more forcible way. But I have to say too that Italy and the Lampedusa thing really do stand out like beacons in what is a very troubled world. So perhaps we should make more of what's happening rather than think of doing more for Lampedusa, but making more of the fact that something's being done as radical as that there. But any publicity, any extra energy, yes is the answer. We must try and dig deep and find some more commitment.
Thank you. That's all the questions, Ian.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Leslie Griffiths, for that panoramic glimpse at many of the possibilities and the challenges that you have the opportunity of pressing towards decision makers, often decision makers with their ears filled with wax, sadly. But I'm glad for this reminder of the Council of Europe in particular, which has had a benign contribution to make to the health of Europe, and still has that potential. And it's not an organization whose boundaries have been artificially created by power and economics.
Yeah.
So thank you again very much. And we send our prayers for the inspiring work that you're able to encourage.
Cool.
Can I just check? I do not see our next speaker. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know you, and I'm very happy to meet you. I take from the fact that you put your hand up that you are Albert de Lange,
Yes.
and
I
not
used the laptop of
Suzanne.
my wife, and so my wife called Suzanne Labs.
Yes.
So, but I'm a man, not a woman.
I understand that. Yes. We have to bear these crosses from time to time. So can I, with pleasure, invite you to speak to us about, now, what were you going to talk about? There was a billing for this item. You're going to talk to us about Henri Arnaud, and who was such a significant figure in the history of the Waldensian Church and the survival of the Waldensian people. So can I invite you to take the floor and talk to us about Henri Arnaud?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Albert de Lange, and I'm born in the Netherlands. Then I met a German wife, my Suzanne Labs. We went together to Italy, and we worked for 5 years in the Waldensian valleys. And then we went to Germany. So I'm a stranger in Germany. In Germany, the people don't speak so much English as in the Netherlands. So I forgot a lot of my English, but I hope you understand me. And I will read my paper because I'm not sure that I can do it without paper. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, or when I'm not clear enough, let me know it. So my paper will be a historical paper, so quite different from the paper of Leslie Griffiths. But I have my subject is Henri Arnaud and the struggle for freedom of religion. So in some kind, these two papers will be connected. I start with the introduction. It took centuries before European states recognized the right of every citizen, including immigrants, to choose his or her own religion and to practice it publicly without interference. In the Middle Ages, when the idea of unity was particularly strong in Western Europe, this right was still strictly denied. The Catholic Church and the authorities of the state jointly persecuted the heretics. The Waldensians experienced this painfully. It was not until the Reformation that the monopoly of the Catholic Church was broken, thus laying the foundation for the development of religious freedom in Europe. In the Holy Roman Empire, the right to religious freedom was recognized for the first time in the Augsburg Religious Peace of 1555. However, this religious freedom only applied to the state. The statesmen decided, the princes, the magistrates, they decided which denomination their territory should belong to. Until 1648, most territories in the empire could only choose between the Catholic and Lutheran confession. After 1648, also the Reformed confession was permitted. Thus, although there had been religious pluralism in Germany, the empire, since 1555, the confessional unity of individual territories was to be preserved. To this end, the formula cuius regio eos religio, that means in whose land, whose faith, was coined. The only freedom of the subjects was that they were granted the jus immigrandi, the right to emigrate if they did not agree with the change of denominations of their authorities. They were therefore allowed to move to a territory of their own denomination. However, only the Catholics, Lutherans, and the Reformed could claim this right. Mennonites, Baptists, etc. continued to be persecuted as heretics and rebels. Duchy of Savoy-Piedmont belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. It is therefore not surprising that the Duke Emmanuel Philibert, which he regained his inheritance in 1559 after almost 30 years of French occupation, the Duke tried to restore the religious unity of his territories. During the French occupation, Swiss Reformed Protestantism gained a foothold in Piedmont as far as Turin, especially as the influence of Calvin, John Calvin. The core area of Reformed Calvinist Protestantism in Piedmont was the so-called Waldensian valleys. Here the Waldensians had been able to hold their own since around 1300 despite the persecutions. Clandestine lay preaching was typical of the medieval Waldensians. From 1555 onwards, the Waldensians decided to build Reformed churches and ordain academically educated pastors. The importance of this decision for the Reformation should not be underestimated. Here, a Protestant religious minority demanded the right to publicly practice its religion, even though the sovereign was Catholic and had the right to determine the confession of his subjects. What choice did the Waldensians have when Emmanuel Philibert, also the Duke of Savoy, decided to take action against them in 1559? They were offered three alternatives. First, voluntary submission by professing Catholicism. Second, martyrdom, suppression of their religion by force. Or third choice, exile in a Protestant country. Calvin recommended the Waldensians exile from Geneva. However, the Waldensians opted for armed resistance, also aware that they could count on military support from the Huguenots in the near Dauphiné. Amazingly, the Waldensians won the war. In 1561, the Waldensians were granted the right to practice their own Reformed religion publicly within their valleys in the peace treaty of Cavour. This success meant that in the course of the 17th century, the Waldenses, when pressed, more often rejected exile and opted for armed resistance. For example, in 1655 and 1663-64, thus defying not only the Duke, but also the ambassadors of the Protestant cantons in Switzerland who had offered the Waldensians asylum. That was my introduction. Now I start with Henri Arnaud. Second, this chapter called Resistance, First Exile and Return, 1686-1694. The Waldensians considered it their right to openly profess their Reformed faith in the valleys. Moreover, they took the choice of armed resistance, and often this armed resistance led to success. But in 1686, things were different. After King Louis XIV had banned the Reformed religion in France in October 1685, the Duke of Savoy, Victor Amadeus II, he was a nephew and ally of the French king, he banned the Waldensians from public worship in January 1686. He offered the Waldensians a choice: voluntary conversion or forced submission. In April 1686, under Swiss pressure, the Duke also offered a third possibility, the Waldensian exile. Henri Arnaud, he was born in 1643 in France. That means he was a Huguenot by origin, and he had been a pastor in the French-occupied Barossa Valley. Arnaud, in 1686, He urged the Waldensians to reject exile. But this time, the armed resistance ended in disaster. Thousands of Waldensians died in the war or in prison. Arnaud himself, he managed to escape to Switzerland. At the beginning, 1687, the Duke of Savoy released about 3,000 Waldensians from the prisons, who went also to Switzerland. Conditions for their release was that the Swiss towns would accommodate them in Germany or the Low Countries. The Waldensians were to give up their valleys for good and live in exile. The Waldensians, however, did not intend to do this and sabotaged as much as possible the Swiss attempts to send them to Germany, because only from Switzerland they could return to the valleys. What encouraged them to undertake these risky, almost hopeless enterprises? I would like to cite two reasons that motivate the Waldensians to do so. The first reason was their desire to recover the 2,000 children they had to leave behind when they were expelled. Secondly, the Waldensians considered the valleys their rightful homeland. They want to return to inhabit and possess the heritage which their ancestors have left them from all times. This heritage also included religion. Waldensians believed that from the time of the apostles they had handed down the pure gospel in the valleys. From the beginning of 1688, the Swiss began to house the Waldensians in Germany, but they only stayed there for a short time because the 9 Years' War broke out in September 1688. Waldensians fled back to Schaffhausen for the French troops. The Netherlands and England, the two main Protestant opponents of France, supported the Waldensians' attempts to return with weapons and money. The Waldensians could tie up French troops in Piedmont. Arnaud was among the leading figures who prepared the armed return of the Waldensians from Switzerland to the valleys. In August 1689, an army of about 1,000 Waldensians and Huguenots reached the valleys. We call this the so-called Glorious Return. And in the valleys, they start a guerrilla war against the French and Piedmontese troops. Fortunately for the troubled returnees, the Duke of Savoy, Victor Amadeus II, broke away from France in June 1690 and joined the anti-French alliance. Diplomatic pressure from the Netherlands, England, and Switzerland led to Victor Amadeus issuing an edict in May 1694, giving the Waldensians back their old rights, including the right to practice the Reformed religion in public. This also applied to Henri Arnaud, who had been a pastor in the valleys again since 1698, even though he came from France. Again, it was confirmed for the Waldensians that armed resistance finally paid off. Next chapter, the second exile, 1696-1703. In August 1696, Victor Amadeus II concluded a special peace with Louis XIV. He got back the Barossa Valley, but had to promise that he would expel all Huguenots and Waldensians of French origin, which included the inhabitants of the Barossa Valley, which included the inhabitants of the Barossa Valley because they had been born under French occupation. In September 1697, the special peace between France and Savoy was incorporated into the General Peace of Rijswijk. This sealed the fate of the French religious refugees in Piedmont. On 1st July 1698, all the Protestants who had been born French subjects, including the Waldensians from the Barossa Valley, were expelled by Victor Amadeus II. There were about 2,800 of them who went in 7 groups to the Swiss Confederation. Many of them were now going into exile for the second time. Artaud also met this fate because he was born in France. How did Arnaud now react to the expulsion of 1698? Did he consider the second exile to be final? Did he now want the Waldensians settled to he now wants the Waldensians to settle in Germany as their new home? Or did he remain secretly active, as after the first exile of 1687, to repatriate the Waldensians this time too, even if the Peace of Rijswijk seemed to rule out the return of the Waldensians? And if this is the case, what reasons moved him? Certainly, Arnaud did not intend to finally place the Waldensians in Germany this time either. In October 1698, he confidentially informed the Dutch envoy in Zurich that he wanted to place the Waldensians from the Waldensian valleys in the Duchy of Württemberg, because from there they could most easily return to their homeland as soon as the opportunity arose, because Württemberg bordered directly on Switzerland. Especially among the Waldensians of the Barossa Valley, the hope of return was alive. They believed that they were entitled to practice the Reformed religion publicly in the valley on the basis of the Edict of 1694, and that Victor Amadeus had only forbidden them to do so under pressure from France. Therefore, they were to be accommodated together, if possible, in their own colonies in Württemberg, in order to be able to carry out the return as soon as there was a chance. In fact, the Dutch ambassador succeeded in bringing the Waldensians from the Barossa Valley to the Duchy of Württemberg in May-June 1699, where they founded their own colonies in Grooswilar, Kleinwilar, Pinache, Serre, and Perouse. You hear the names are exactly the same as the names of these places nowadays in the Barossa Valley. However, this happened in absence of Henri Arnaud, who was in England from January to July 1699. Journey from Arnaud to England served to secure financial support for the Waldensian colonies in Germany. But not only. Arnaud was aware that the return of the Waldensians to the Barossa Valley was only possible if he could count on the support of the Protestant powers, especially England and the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, as in the Protestant places of Switzerland, there was already a strong ecclesiastical lobby in favor of the Waldenses, because the Reformed Church was the dominant one here. In England, on the other hand, this lobby still had to be built up for the most part, because the Anglican Church had been the state religion there since the Restoration. Arnaud wanted to win the Anglican Church for the Waldensian cause. In London, Arnaud skillfully used the legend of the apostolic origin of the Waldensians, an argument to which the representatives of the High Church were particularly receptive. It is certainly no coincidence that Arnaud repeatedly spoke in England about the return of 1689. The Anglicans were to be convinced that the valleys in Piedmont were the true home of the Waldensians and that they had the right to profess their ancient faith there. Arnaud's hope for return was also theologically motivated, as it had been in 1689. He was convinced that God himself would miraculously intervene in favor of the Waldensians. This was not as far removed from reality as one might think. Less than 2 years later, the War of the Spanish Successions broke out. As in the 9 Years' War, a great alliance was again formed, in which England this time took the leading role. The Duke of Savoy, Victor Amadeus II, switches again to the anti-French alliance in October 1703, as he had done before in June 1690. Victor Amadeus promised the Netherlands and England to allow the Waldensians back into the Barossa Valley. In October 1703, Victor Amadeus invited the Waldensians to return from Germany. Arnaud, who was by now over 60 years old, took over. However, this time the return was anything but glorious. Only about 150 Waldensians followed Arnaud. Most of the colonists in Germany apparently no longer had faith in the Duke's promises and did not want to experience a third exile. Arnaud also experienced one disappointment after another in the valleys. Therefore, at the end of 1706, he decided to return in Württemberg. This does not mean, however, that he completely buried the hope of returning. It was certainly no coincidence that Arnaud published the Histoire de la glorieuse rentrée, History of the Glorious Return, 1710, when the war was still in progress. In his dedication to Queen Anne, who had succeeded William III in 1702, he wrote that God willed that she, thus Anne, does not make peace until the candlestick of Jesus Christ is lit again in the places where persecution has extinguished it, in Hungary, France, and in the valley of Perouse. However, as had already happened in Rijswijk in 1697, the peace negotiations in Utrecht in 1713 also ended without any visible results for the Waldensians and Huguenots. Their return to their homeland was and remained impossible unless they were prepared to become Catholic. It's a question whether Arnaud himself was still able to acknowledge that the Barossa Valley was definitely lost to the Waldenses. His trust in God seems never to have failed him until his death in 1721. As late as 1719, he was still preaching about the two witnesses who God would raise up again after 3.5 years. Two testimonies are the Huguenots and the Waldensians. In the meantime, it had become lonely around Arnaud. For the Waldensians in Germany, the time of the end-time struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism had long since passed. They were bitterly poor and completely occupied with the daily struggle for survival. Arnaud died in Schöneberg in 1721. Schöneberg is a little village in Colony in Württemberg, and he was buried there in the church he had built. Thank you very much for your attention. I wanted to show you that Arnaud tried to keep or to gain the religious freedom in Piedmont. He succeeded in the Waldensian valleys, nowadays called Waldensian valleys, or the Waldperlitje, Germanaska, and part of the Barossa Valley, but the biggest place, the rest of the Barossa Valley, so where you find the Pinasca, Perouse, and Villars, remained Catholic. So he died in exile. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a panoramic view of the difficult times and the faithful way in which Arnaud struggled to keep the Waldensian flame alight and brought well, a continuation of the Waldensian tradition, although not the unification perhaps that he would have liked. So who would like to ask Albert a question or make any observation?
So the first one is Richard Grucott even. Sorry, Richard.
Hello, Albert. This is Richard Grocott. I think we met some years ago.
Yes, remember.
At that synod, yes. I was just reflecting as you're speaking on how so many religious and ethnic communities have spent time in exile. And I guess, you know, we think even in biblical times of the people of Israel, the periods they spent in captivity in Egypt and in Babylon as well, and how difficult and painful the experience of exile is, but how often formative it is on the character of those people, particularly after they come back and return to their promised land, which is, I guess, what the valleys were to the Waldensian people. I know the Waldensian return was difficult and painful, and it wasn't always a glorious return, as you've as you said. But I wonder whether you and maybe others today who are present might just reflect on whether it is true to say that Waldensian identity was very much formed and created during that period of exile, and even on current identity today.
Yes, I think you're right. That for Arnaud, when he preached in 1689, he held a sermon before leaving, returning with his 1,000 men. He held a sermon, and in which he made the comparison between the Waldensians and the people of Israel. People of Israel who are in Egypt, and they will return. Savoy is the desert. We arrive in the promised land of the valleys. I think that is interesting, but that's already before the glorious return, that the Waldensians get some ethnical, there seems to be an ethnia people, and they used also the category of people in the 1561 when they started to become reformed. They identify, you see already that they're starting to identify themselves with the people of Israel. So Catholics, for them, Catholics is the enemy. Or the anti-Catholic identity connected with, just like the people of Israel tries to distinguish themselves from the neighbor people. So you have this ethnical identity who starts in the 16th century and who has, because also of the politics of the dukes, become more and more stronger. We call it in Germany confessionalization. So the Waldensians, you see it also in England, I think, that the confessionalization of the different churches, everybody thinks that there's the real church. So the Waldensians don't identify themselves with the Piedmont, but with the Waldensian valleys, who is their homeland and the promised land. And I think that's, you find also Arnaud, and you find it by Alexis Muston, and you find it still some people nowadays. And then there's the apocalyptical tradition, the two testimonies that's in, especially for Arnaud, is the 14th. For him, Louis the 14th is the Antichrist. So, and he said there are two, from the book of Revelations, you have the two testimonies who dare to resist to the Antichrist. They were killed, but after 3.5 days, for Arnaud is 3.5 years, they resurrected and gained the war against the Antichrist, and they will survive. So I think the Huguenots and the Waldensians, they will struggle with Louis XIV, and they will gain the victory because God is sustaining them. So with Arnaud, you have not only this ethnical, but also this apocalyptical vision of the history.
Okay.
I can't see any other questions, Ian.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for that question, and thank you.
I think
for...
Erika wants to say something. Erika Scroppo. She's
indicating.
You have to open your
Sorry,
last.
I've just seen people waving hands. If you just wave your hands, I can't see you because it's a long. If you use your reactions, that's great. But Erica, I can see you waving your hand now. So do you want to ask a question? Go for it.
You have to open your loudspeaker, your microphone.
Yeah, you need to unmute.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask a question to Albert. How about the warrior and the commandant, or commandant? He was certainly a pacifist or anti-war person. Will that be something that will also be used by the resistance fighters, many of them Waldensian and believers, including the person I'm talking about later.
Yes, if I understand you well, Arnaud certainly was not a pacifist. But in the Waldensian tradition, the pastors would not take up their arms. So you have a lot of very militant pastors who were accompanying the troops, the Waldensians, but they did not take the arms. You have the famous Waldensian commandant Janavel. He wrote a program for how to do the holy war. But in this holy war against the Duke, the pastors has to give consolation, to help the dying people, etc. They must be protected by the soldiers, but for themselves, they don't have to take up the arms. I think Arnaud, in 1691, he was in the Netherlands and he met William III, the King of England in that moment, but he was also stadtholder of the Netherlands, so he was in The Hague for meeting all the allies against Louis XIV. In that occasion, Arnaud went to him and he became nominated as colonel. And Arnaud went to Amsterdam and he made a print. He made a visit card, but a big visit card. There he is presented as a pastor with arms. And I believe that during his life, he also killed some Piemontese, that he was also using the arms. He used the arms. So it's very rare that he not only did that, but that he also presented himself as a pastor with a sword, a Bible. So he is not as a pacifist, but as a holy warrior. And that is, I think he was the first. I don't know any pastor. I think even in Cromwell army, pastors did not take up the arms and were only accompanying the soldiers. But Arnaud is a very rare example of a reformed pastor who took up the arms.
Thank you. And I think Nikki had a question as well. Nikki.
Hi, Albert. I think we've met as well because I was a volunteer Torre and I know your wife quite well. What I was wanting to ask is how or if Henri Arnaud is remembered in Waldensian circles now.
Remembered nowadays. Last year, it was the 300 years ago that Henri Arnaud died at Schönenberg. So 1721 he died, and in 2021 we remembered is in Germany, but also in Italy. They remembered 300 years ago Arnaud died, but it was also the year of COVID. So in Germany, we organized a lot of things, but a lot of things also could not take place because of the COVID. But we try to actualize, to give an actual interpretation of Henri Arnaud, asking or make the connection to the problem of nowadays that so many people of this world, so many people did not enjoy religious freedom. And we ask if the people have the right or not the right to take up the arms to defend the religion. You can, in China, we took as an example Syria, but also in Romania in the times of communism. So we ask a lot of people to give a contribution. In Germany, we did so, contribution about religious freedom and arms. Because, you know, in the German Constitution, that is typical for Germany. I don't think there's any other country in Europe. The German Constitution, you have one article in which it said that when the government is repressive, you as a German citizen, you have the right to take up the arms to defend your freedom when the state is a dictatorship. So that was the way we did in Germany, tried to do it in Germany because a lot of things could not take place. In Italy, it was natuurlijk also the same problem. I was asked to write a Opuscolo del 17 febbraio. So that is every year there's a who appears the 17th of February, the day of the emancipation, the civil freedom of the Waldensians. So they asked me to write a booklet about Henri Arnaud, and also I pointed to his significance for the religious freedom in Piedmont. And I think Scott is not a religious freedom in the sense that everybody can believe what he wants, but the biconfessionality, so that not only the Catholic Church is permitted in Piedmont, but also freedom for the Reformed public exercise of religion. And I think that was a big importance, the importance of Arnaud, that he contributed to this religious freedom in Piedmont in Italy. It was the only place in Italy, or only region in Italy, where there was a second church, not Catholic Church.
Thank you. That's the last question, Ian, that I can say.
Thank you very much again, Albert, for that really quite inspiring picture of Arnaud and his contribution and his and how we still have a legacy of the issues that he struggled with. Can I now ask Erica Scroppo to come to the microphone and to talk to us about Jacopo Lombardini? Erica needs no introduction, I think. You're silent. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you now,
hear
Erica.
me?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Okay, fine. One thing I wanted to add about Albert's talk was that, for instance, Zwingli was another one who was fighting and died fighting, if I'm not wrong. He died anyway. Yeah, I think everyone knows who Zwingli is. Otherwise, I can say he was the reformer, or the leader of the reformer of the Zurich canton in Switzerland. Anyway, so some time ago. But the fighting brings us to something more modern, but not contemporary, which is Jacopo Lombardini, and which is again a very interesting person who, in a way, has a life that is not different from some life of other people who became Waldensians or Methodists in Italy, like a relative of mine, but one word, just one sentence, who was a priest, and then was in crisis. He was a modernist, and then went to, by chance, passed in front of the church of the church of the Waldensian Church in Rome, went in, and then he became a Waldensian pastor, and then he married in my family in Sicily, and so and so. But that is nothing to do with Lombardini, but similar story. So Lombardini was born, Jacopo Lombardini. I have a feeling that his name came from Jacopo Ortis by Foscolo, the poet Foscolo, because the family was resistant, was risorgimentale and liberal. So very, very possible that they loved Ugo Foscolo very much. Anyway, he was born in the Alpi Apuane, which are called Alps, but they're not Alps, but they are white, where the very famous white marble comes from, used for centuries, and in a family of miners. And but the father had been also a follower of Garibaldi, so he was brought up in believing Garibaldi, Mazzini, and Jesus were three important people in his life, in his beliefs, and very, very soon was very keen on all the things that he later believed in, like freedom and liberalism and republicanism and so on. And but wasn't very loved by his father, for instance, because he was very tall, very thin, and couldn't be neither a good miner or a good fighter. So he went to study and became a school teacher, a primary school teacher, which I think was all the family could afford. And then he was born in 1892, and he was in favor of the Italian participation to the First World War, while many part of the Socialist Party was against, but he wasn't a socialist. And very soon, when he was young, very young, could see the results of what had happened to the Italian people, Italian soldiers who had felt defeated and so on, and how fascism started because of several problems, included on one side, the feeling of being let down, and the other side was another side of terror of a communist revolution, which was very possible in Italy because there were lots of unresting and strikes and so on. Anyway, so he was always very keen, Jacopo Lombardini, on saying what his ideas were. He was always very keen on freedom and freedom of everyone to talk and to express themselves, and was very soon in the eye under the control of the fascist people. It wasn't a regime yet, but he was already persecuted even before the unfamous, we say infame, not very good, Marcia su Roma, the March on Rome in 1922. So before that, even in 1920, 1921, he was already persecuted as an anti-fascist. So he had to stop teaching, was beaten, was imprisoned, and lots of other things in the area where he was. And so he felt under a lot of pressure. But what happened to him, a very important time when he was really unhappy, was that he passed in front of the church, Methodist church in Carrara, heard somebody singing and went in, and who was preaching was a pastor from the south. I can't remember, but I met him, I knew him, who was preaching, was a Waldensian pastor, and then he talked to him, they became friends, and then not very, I just tried to find the date, but anyway, not very late, much later, Lombardini decided that was the church he wanted to follow. Yes, I think it was 1921, 1922. And after that, he became very keen and found that everything was coinciding with the Jesus he believed in, and eventually became a preacher. Then he thought he needed to study no more, so went to Rome to the faculty of the Waldensian Faculty of Theology. That's where he made lots of Waldensian friends, who then led him to the north, where he ended up later on. But he didn't get a degree. He didn't become a pastor for, I don't know what his personal reasons were, but anyway, he was always a bit troubled and had lots of problems, until he decided that his life was to go and be a preacher in the north. Before that, apparently he tried to commit suicide. We don't know exactly when, because the books are very reticent on whatever problems he might have had. Threw himself in the river Tevere, but didn't drown. After that, he thought his mission was to live again in a different way, be happy, and eventually ended up in the Waldensian valleys. We are all talking about the Waldensian valleys today. And he was very keen on theology, on Barth theology, on theology of the confessing church, and this kind of anti-following Hitler or regime churches. And he found that in the valleys, not everyone, of course, but many people had his ideas, and he could feel he was at home. And he had always had a great admiration, a great love of the valleys, even before arriving. He first arrived in Turin, then he went to the valleys, and in Torre Pellice he was accepted or hosted with great love by by the people of the church, and became a tutor to Convitto, which is now the museum and Centro Culturale Valdese. And he gained more and more students who were, or friends, either minister or students, who then remember him a lot. And I remember him forever for all his teaching, because he was always very happy to talk to everyone. And so he was friends with all people who you may have heard of, from Giorgio Spini, who was in the south, but they had met in Carrara, from Tuscany, sorry, had met in Carrara, to Roberto Malan, who was to become an important member, well, maybe the leader of the rights of Giustizia, Libertà, Justice and Liberty, the resistance movement in the Waldensian valleys. And I don't know, how can I say, other people that not very well known by everyone, but, you know, important names that became very, very fixed in the decision of being faithful to whatever there was to do, and eventually ended up with the participation in the resistance. What I found very, very moving was that a couple of days ago, by chance, I managed to watch a short film about Jacopo Lombardini that was shot by the students of the Collegio Valdese in Torre Pellice, and talking about a short period of his life, exactly when he had to flee Torre Pellice because again the fascists were after him, and ended up in Villar Pellice, which is not far away, at the house of a minister who was Roberto Jaillet, or Tini Jaillet, friends of my father, the one who did the pictures we had in the Waldensian calendars a few years ago. And then it was a problem of going somewhere else, because that wasn't a place where secure, because the first place apparently where the Gestapo of the fascists or the Nazis will go and visit in the valleys would be the house of the pastor. So what happened is the pastor had a little boy who's still alive, 92. We know him very well, Enrico Jaillet, who was interviewed. I mean, he was the only old person in the film, because the other ones were student acting or somebody who is now the headmaster of the Collegio. But he was interviewed because he, age 12, at nearly night, was asked by his father to take Jacopo Lombardini to a place called Pertusel on the top of the mountains above Villar. One can go by car if you dare, but it's not very easy. And they were running apparently in order to meet some partisans of the resistance. That was 1943, and join them, because that was going to be the only safe place for Jacopo to be. And so there was the interview of Enrico Jaillet saying what he remembered, and you know what he, for him and for the family Lombardini, was. And certainly I will make sure that when I go to Italy, I'll go and see the Jaillet family and ask them more. And then the little boy, age 12, ran down to Villar, obviously not in the place where cars can go. There were no cars then, and nobody was going there by car. Running down and finding it slightly difficult, but he managed to arrive home. Think of what 12-year-olds do now. Some are still in nappies, and you feel, goodness me. But maybe it's what hard times make. You know, if everything is easy, you find time to think of yourself and your new shoes. If you have other things to do, you become brave and do things that nobody may think of. Anyway, what Jacopo Lombardini did with the partisan, they took him to Bagnaro. This is the other side, not the side of Valpellice. Well, one corner of Valpellice Valley were called Val d'Angrogna, where there were strong groups of partisans. Several of them had been students at Collegio Valdese, and or several had been tutored by Jacopo Lombardini. So it was a reunion, and they were hidden in a house, in a farmhouse called no, I don't know how it's called now, but I don't know. Anyway, Pagnao, which means place, which is a plain with some water for animals, and then he stayed there with them and helped them, and he never took part in the active shooting. He was a chaplain, and the only weapon he always carried was a Bible. But eventually, and he was a great source of support and help for the people, the young people who were fighting there. He was also in touch with the people who did the delivery, the delivery of news and things, many of them women, whom, you know, I was, as a child, I always heard talking about this fantastic person called Jacopo Lombardini. I knew so many people who knew him, who loved him, who really cherished him, like as well as Lobue and other people like him. Anyway, so he was there until the spring of 1944, I think. He was the group of fighters at Pagnao were captured. There were tanks and lots of soldiers from Germany, occupying Germans, who took them, and some managed to escape, but they took Lombardini, who was the real, in their opinion, was the real enemy of Nazi constitution and Nazi parties. He was taken to different places. He was beaten, he was tortured, all sorts of things you can imagine, but he survived. And he was taken to Fossoli, which was a concentration camp in Italy, and to other places, first to Turin, of course, and then to different prisons, and then it ended up in Mauthausen. And my question is often, how many Methodist preachers ended up in Mauthausen? And people stare at me, they don't know what to say. So I think he should be much more known also by the British Methodists or by the international Methodists. And still there, he was always in good humor, very good temperament, very good preaching, of course, but also listening to people and consoling them if they were not believers. And yeah, my husband reminded me that we had some years ago in Torre Pellices, we heard somebody who had been, he wasn't a Waldensian, I think, had been in prison with him and wasn't killed just because his surname started by M, and Lombardini was L, so he was one of the last to be killed, while the next day they were going to kill also the person who talked about, who survived, because he was M, and Mauthausen was liberated. But anyway, so poor Lombardini ended up being, I thought he had been hanged, but apparently had been gassed. Not a great difference, I suppose. And he ended up in Mauthausen. I don't know if I said that because I'm a bit confused this morning. But everyone who met him was always full of thankfulness and peace and yeah, because he was and also the only place where they could have some I don't know, services or anyway just some Bible reading was in the loo. And so that's what Jacopo Lombardini was doing, always happy, never discouraged by anything. And anyway, so unfortunately, he was one of the last people to be killed in Mauthausen in 24th of April, 1945. And there are a couple of books written in Italian. I think the first one was written ages ago, and I remember reading it in 1960s or something. The second one is full of documents and things, but maybe we should try and write a more easy, more just without too many intervention and notes by other people. maybe we should think of that, because I think he was a really important person in Italy, and especially for the Waldensian valleys. Finito.
Okay.
Thank you, Erica. Is there any questions? Would people raise their hand using the reactions? Then I can see you if there are questions. I can't see any. So, Ian, over to you.
Well, we've had a full and varied program of talks. We are just after the 12 o'clock hour, and so I can say a heartfelt thank you to Erica for her insights, and to Albert de Lange for his account of the trials and aspirations of Henri Arnaud, and to Lord Leslie Griffiths for his sharing with us some insights into his busy activities and what inspires him in the Council of Europe and in the projects he seeks to promote in the House of Lords. So I think we're at a point where we can come to a conclusion, and to thank everybody. Thank you all for coming in impressive numbers to join in this event. And it shows that we can put together a program that does attract. And if there are topics or speakers that you particularly would like to have included in a future program, then do please write to us or contact us to look at that, and we could see what is going to be possible. Does anyone have anything final that they wish to say? There's some nice messages of thanks coming on the chat.
Huguenot Society, our friend.
And we're grateful for those. So you can take some inspiration away from what we have heard, and some challenges and encouragement to grow and be more faithful servants of Christ. So I will close by asking you to join in saying the grace. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God
and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit
be with us all.
evermore. Amen.